many rural areas of the American West, cutting firewood in national forests is a necessary chore if you want a warm house through the winter. Our home in mountainous central Idaho was no exception. It was normal for my dad to pick me and my brothers up after school and head into the mountains for an afternoon of firewood gathering. My dad would fell the dead trees, then saw them into chunks. My brothers and I had the task of rolling the wood to the truck and loading it. We would continue this assembly line process until we had a truckload of wood, usually before nightfall. Hot, sweaty, and exhausted, we would pile into the truck cab and make our way down the mountain. At home, the next day, we would unload and split the wood and stack it into neat little rows. This process was repeated until we had a winter's worth of fuel for a house, our grandma's cabin, and any extra for elderly neighbours. This particular afternoon, we decided to try a different logging road on the other side of the valley. This was well outside our familiar logging area. No real reason for the change, but my dad said he wanted a change of scenery. This logging road hadn't been maintained in some time. Large rocks and fallen branches littered the path. My brothers and I had to walk out in front, pushing rocks and wood out of the way as my dad lurched the truck up the switchbacks. Yard by yard, we slowly made our way up the mountain. That hike was physically brutal as we ascended the mountain and got farther into the trees. This odd feeling started to set in. I wasn't sure if it was the exhaustion from the hike or something more. There was electricity in the air, like the whole mountain was buzzing at a wavelength just below my senses. In some odd way, it felt like the mountain knew we were there, and it wasn't welcome to the fact. I wanted to say something to my brothers, but before I opened my mouth, my younger brother said, "Does anyone else feel like we're not welcome here?" My older brother and I stopped in our tracks and looked back at him. Both of us nodded in agreement. This moment was broken by my dad honking and monitoring us to continue clearing the path. Reluctantly, we pushed forward to a small clearing in the woods, where we finally stopped the truck. My dad, oblivious to our apprehension, or simply choosing to ignore it, grabbed his saw and went to work. As the wood was felled and loaded, I couldn't shake this ominous feeling enveloping me like a dark shroud. I noticed my brothers were taking occasional glances over their shoulders as we worked. Everyone but my dad, it seemed, was on edge. The sun nestled down into the trees and twilight began to set in. As the light drained from the sky, my anxiety only intensified. It wasn't until my dad unexpectedly told us to load up that a wave of relief flooded over me. I could see the tension in my brothers melt away as well. The truck wasn't fully loaded, an oddity. Getting a half load was a waste, according to my dad. We would sometimes work into the dark just to make sure the truck was full. But tonight, he seemed eager to head home. With everything loaded, we started down the road. Although dead tired, everyone seemed to be in a much lighter mood. We were chatting and cracking jokes while trying to blow off steam from the afternoon. We were almost out of the tree line and into the valley desert. Going down the switchbacks, you want to be careful, especially with a load, even if it was half that. A brown blur jumped up from down the slope side of the switchback.
"Shit!"
was the only word that came out of my dad's mouth as he slammed on the brakes. Loaded with wood and travelling downhill, there was no way to avoid smashing into the blur. The truck finally ground to a standstill. The four of us peered through the windshield. Nobody saying a word. Illuminated in the yellow glow of our headlights was a crumpled body of deer. Grumbling and cursing the deer's existence, my dad exited the truck to investigate. Doing as they were told, my brothers stayed put in the truck. I didn't listen, following close behind my dad. The truck was fine. We hadn't been travelling fast when we smacked the deer. Just some hair and blood in the grill guard. Hitting a deer really wasn't that unusual. The mountains were full of them. What was unusual was that the deer dropped so quickly. At faster speeds, deer could still be upright and sprinting away to die into the woods after a collision. That last burst of an adrenaline dump, this one, fell over like a rag doll. Before even approaching the carcass, a deep, foul smell hit us. Deer smell bad when they're alive, but this was on a whole nother level. It was the smell of decay and rot. My stomach began to turn as we got closer. My nostrils were burning. Coming up on the deer, it was clearly dead. Really, really dead. The stench was so overwhelming, my eyes were watering. The body was a true horror scene. The deer's eyes were gone, replaced with sunken, hollow hole. As if to overcompensate for the absence, the tongue was swollen and black as coal. It could not be contained and hung out the side of its mouth. The underbelly was split open. Entrails and offal spilled into the dirt. In the dim headlights, it looked as though the deer's fur and viscera were moving. Holding my breath, I bent down for a closer look, and my heart stopped. The deer, inside and out, was covered in maggots. It was dead all right, but our truck didn't kill it. Clearly, it had been dead for days, if not weeks. I backed away, retching. That electric anxiety came screaming back. My dad was always the quiet, stoic type, but right now, even in the dim headlights of the truck, I could see the abject horror on his face. His gaze wasn't on the deer, but focused down the mountain. Poorly masking the fear in his voice, he told me firmly to walk back to the truck and get inside. I obeyed without objection. As I grabbed the door handle, a loud shriek came out of the trees. Branches were shattering and breaking. Something was heading up the slope towards us. I slammed my door closed just as my dad reached the truck. Before his door was shut, he pressed on the accelerator. The truck launched forward, sending us over the deer carcass and racing downhill, with mine and my brothers yelling. It was hard to tell if the shrieking was following us. Our truck popped out of the tree line and into the desert sagebrush. Once out of the woods, everything quietened down. We were left with only the rumble of the engine and wind through the half-open windows. Pulling into our property, the truck came to a stop. We sat in silence. No one moved to leave the truck. Everyone started talking at once. We all had questions. What was the screaming? How does a dead deer jump uphill in front of a truck? There was no way the truck killed it. Dad just shook his head and motioned for us to quiet down. That deer was dead when we hit it. It didn't jump out in front of us. It was thrown at us. We stared at him. He explained that all day up on the mountain, he had felt uneasy. Not wanting to worry us boys, he kept it to himself. He described it like walking into a stranger's living room while they were upstairs asleep. That feeling never left him, and as twilight came, he happened to catch a shadow in the corner of his eye, not far into the woods, and saw figures moving from tree to tree. He couldn't focus on them long enough for a good look before they dodged behind trees. His stomach dropped. Working hard to keep his composure, he hurried us to the truck to leave. It was after hitting the deer and discovering it was long dead that my dad pieced together what was happening. Something threw that deer to get us to stop. Before the shrieking began, he could hear something moving in the darkness beyond the road. It was a trap. Running back to the truck could have started an ambush or triggered a prey drive. So we walked back to the truck. The second we were inside, he drove that truck downhill with no intention of stopping for anyone or anything. That feeling of electricity didn't disappear until we hit the county highway. My brothers and I never saw anything as we drove away, but those screams from the forest will never leave my mind. We didn't gather firewood for the rest of the season. For the first time in his life, my dad just bought what we needed. And although we started to gather wood again the next season, we've never been back up that particular mountain. The Forest Service has permanently closed and reclaimed that road. The only way back up into those woods is a long hike. One I'm not interested in ever taking again. Whatever was on that mountain, whatever threw that deer carcass, whatever chased us out of those woods, it did not want us there. It wanted us gone. Or worse, it wanted us dead. When I was younger, I lived in a very strange situation in the woods. I'm not sure if this encounter may have been some kind of entity, or perhaps something different. I'm a female, and when I was around 12 years old, one of my best friends, let's call him Alex, who was about 10. Alex's father had purchased a large amount of forested land around 100 kilometres away from the city, and we lived in Montreal, Canada. It was all forest when Alex's family acquired it. They cleared a little patch to build a house, and the rest was pure, unadulterated forest. Their land was cut in two by a dirt road that, if you followed it for several kilometres, it led to a few houses, and their land was very different depending on which side of the dirt road you looked. Now on the right side, where their house was, the forest was light and luminous, or at least it felt that way. It was not too dense with rolling hills, a real lovely place to play. On the left side of the road, however, that was another story. First, there was a deep ditch, perhaps 2 metres deep, which then became a quite high and steep hill. Weirdly enough, all along the long road, the ditch was full of car parts, a set of car wheels here, a door there, a steering wheel way over there, all old and overgrown with moss. And over the steep hill, the forest gave off a really bad vibe. It had lots of very tall, dark coniferous trees, with almost black trunks, and the place seemed somehow devoid of light or life. Climbing the hill, which we seldom were willing to do because of the creeps that it just gave us, there was some sort of swamp there. When we were there was this strange pressure. We sensed a kind of animal instinct that told us to leave this place. The strange atmosphere was spontaneously obvious to both me and Alex, and we playfully called that side of the road Demon's Forest. One weekend in the day, probably 2001 or 2002, my family and I came to visit Alex's family. Bored by the adults, my friend and I decided to go and play in the forest. Alex's father told us to watch out. There was an animal that had been rummaging in their trash bin and causing other nuisances. He said it was a dog that looked somewhat like a Rottweiler, that surely belonged to someone living up that dirt road. He warned us that we shouldn't interact with the dog if we saw it, as it didn't look healthy as far as he could tell, or something was weird about it. He said it somehow looked diseased or contagious, or had patches of fur missing. I can't exactly remember. We were slightly creeped out of going up the road because of the weird vibes of the forest to the left side. But we were challenging ourselves to be brave and trying not to really think about how unsettling it felt. A good distance away from their home, when it was already well out of sight, I noticed the first strange thing of the day. Out of the steep hill on the left side of the road, there was a very large and dark pine tree hanging over the road. Somebody had attached a pink ribbon to one of the branches, which was already strange, since this was the territory of Alex's family. They had no daughters or other little girls likely to hang around, or other people who may be owners of pink ribbons who were likely to hang out on this deserted road. The strange thing was, the ribbon was flailing strongly in the wind. Its loose ends were flapping almost horizontally. One other thing to note is that it was completely windless that day. There was no wind to speak of. The ribbon was within my reach, so I even reached up and touched it as it was flailing. I licked my fingers and held it in the air to check if I could feel any wind or air current at all. Now the air, it was perfectly still, yet the ribbon flailed. I mentioned it to my friend. Now he seemed distracted and was younger than me and sometimes didn't catch on to what I said. So I didn't press the matter. We just continued our climb. We reached a place where the hill on the left side of the road had a gentler slope, and it began further away from the road. In fact, it looked as if the hill was kind of carved out in a way that would have made it easy for us to climb to get into Demon's Forest. It almost seemed as if the hill was carved in a sloping half circle, like in a theatre, and the road we stood on would have been the stage. It gave us a very clear, treeless view of the hillside, full of golden and red fallen leaves. The trees began at the top of the hill, maybe 9 metres higher. We stopped to admire the view. Canadian autumns are a sight to behold. Alex suddenly got really excited. He thought he heard something in the demon woods up the hill, and he really wanted me to pay attention. He explained that there are wild cats in that forest. They had spotted them with his dad. One of them reportedly had kittens. Kittens being one of the most exciting things in the world for kids our age, getting us all riled up. But somehow, my hackles were up, and I couldn't really relax, even thinking about adorable wild kittens. He actually thought he had heard the cat meow in the forest, up the hill close by. I heard nothing of the sort, and thought he was inventing it. He suggested that we try meowing at it to see if it would respond. Maybe it would even bring its kittens along, and we could see them and play with them. I hadn't heard any sounds at all, and didn't really like his idea of screaming meows into that creepy forest. What kind of wild cat would respond to human children anyway? Wouldn't it be obvious that we are not cats by the sound of us? It seemed like a dumb idea to me. Before I could try and talk him out of it, he loudly meowed into the forest. To my utter shock, the forest meowed back. Alex was delighted and meowed again. Something in the forest answered again. I was actually shocked. This didn't make sense to me, and it creeped me out. But I suspended my disbelief to see what would happen. He kept doing meowing over and over. For every one of his meows, there was one coming back in response from the woods. Something felt off to me. Feral or wild animals didn't behave that way. Even at 12 years old, I realised that. And there was no echo. The cat did not bounce back any sound that we threw at it except meows, which it reciprocated immediately. And anyway, there were no hard rocky surfaces around, off of which sound could bounce off. There was a rustle of dead leaves coming from above us, from above the slope in the creepy forest. It seemed like the rustling was getting closer to us, but it was way off. Because cats are small and light and careful with their steps, they don't make a ruckus when they walk through the woods. But here, the rustling leaves sound was extremely obvious, along with the meowing. And in fact, it sounded more like steps, like somebody with 2 legs walking in the leaves. And it was getting closer to us. My alarm signals were starting to go off with the wrongness of it all, while my younger friend was oblivious. He was calling it more, noticing that it was coming towards us. Then I realised what seemed so wrong. The sound was coming towards us, but there was nothing to be seen. Right in front of us, we had the gently sloping hill, treeless and clearly visible. Anything coming from that forest should have been plainly exposed to view. There was nothing. No source for the rustling sound. Nothing moving. Oh, her kittens are joining her. Listen, there are more sounds. They're coming to play with us. He was right. The walking sound seemed to have multiplied and now came from various directions at once, even getting closer, with nothing being visible. Something was way off. I wanted to leave, but Alex was getting mad at me. The kittens were almost here, and he wanted to see them. He insisted. At this point, it was extremely tense, and fight or flight was activating from the wrongness of it all. We were alone and quite exposed on this theatre stage to whatever was getting closer to us, which was more and more obviously with every moment. Decidedly not kittens, I was on the verge to force him to go run home. Suddenly, I heard a very loud panting sound right at my feet. During the first millisecond, I got only mildly surprised. We had a huge husky at home. I was used to it panting next to my feet. But then, a sense of profound dread drowned on me. That I realised my dog was not here, and it must be another dog, a very big one, right at my feet. I panically looked down, ready to jump away from the dog that somehow got extremely close to me, almost on me, without my noticing. only to find that there was absolutely nothing at my feet. But I could still hear that loud, breathy panting sound coming from there. I whirl around all 360 degrees, screaming, "Where is that coming from? There is nothing there." Yet the sound is clearly there. Around 100 meters away, off the top of the slope, I see a lone dog standing. It looks somewhat similar to a Rottweiler, but in very, very bad shape, extremely unkempt, with patches of fur missing, shaggy and dirty as hell, with some skin exposed where the fur is missing. It looked down at us too. There is no way that I could hear panting at that distance, and the source of the sound is at my feet. At that point, the flight instinct wins inside me. I have never run as desperately and as fast in my whole life. Thank goodness it was all downhill. Alex kept pace right beside me, terrified. We made it home in one piece. We didn't walk in these woods anymore. I've since come back to Alex's place several times in my life. I never wanted to walk in the woods again. We had amazing parties at his house as teenagers. I was often there rather drunk and having a great time. But I always had this very stressful sensation when I went out of his house, especially at night. When I slept over there, I had these extremely strange experiences where I'd wake up. I sensed as if something was there and was observing me. In my mid-awake state, I even saw something floating near the ceiling. It had the sensation that it was not an immediate threat though. It was observing. I'm not sure that whatever this is was related to what happened on the dirt road. We've never discussed what happened that day. As I research it now, I see that this land is historically Algonquin land. The one source seemed to say Mohawk. If anyone can help clarify what happened, I would be thankful.